So today we're here with Timothy Thomas Powers, or better known with his nickname, his pen name, Tim Powers. Born on 1952 in Buffalo, New York, he moved to California at the age of 7 in 1959. 11 years later, he attended my alma mater, or current school I'm going to, Cal State Fullerton, from 1970 to 1976. He's a successful American sci-fi and fantasy novelist with more than 14 novels published, and another book on the way this year. Congratulations.
Ideally.
And apparently, too, according to his Wikipedia site, he loves a decent scotch. On Stranger Tides is one of his most influential novels, as it was the main source of inspiration for the latest installment in Pirates of the Caribbean, as well as the classic adventure game The Secrets of Monkey Island. Not to also mention William Gibson, the author of Neuromancer, and more importantly a cyberpunk enthusiast, reviews Mr. Powers' writing as simply brilliant. He has been nominated for the BSFA Award, the Locust Fantasy Award, the World Fantasy Awards, and the Phil K. Dick Award. He won the World Fantasy Award twice for his novels Last Call and Declare, and of course he won the Phil K. Dick Award for Dinner at Deviant's Palace. Alongside being an accomplished writer, he is currently an educator here at Orange County High School of the Arts, and was formerly an educator at University of Redlands, correct?
And what?
University of Redlands?
Have taught there, yeah. And at Chapman.
And in Chapman?
From time to time, on a part-time basis.
And his new upcoming novel is called Nobody's Home. First of all, Mr. Powers, it is such a great pleasure to finally meet you, and I just want to thank you for taking the time to meet us up.
Oh, happy to.
Yeah, you and Phil K. Dick share a similarity in your childhoods, where you were both born in a busy city, or relatively busy city in comparison with Orange County. You from New York and him from Chicago. But also that you guys both moved at an early age from those cities and moved to California. And in your time here in the Orange County, you seem to have enjoyed it very thoroughly. Could you tell us more about the experiences of growing up here?
Well, yeah, I grew until age 7. I was on the East Coast, and the main thing I remember is snow. And when my father asked us kids one evening, what would you think of moving to California? We all just said, yes, now. Which strikes me now as kind of odd because presumably we had friends back east there, and we knew nothing about California, but yeah, we just all for it, yes, let's do it. And then now that I've been here, I'm not a native, but I've been a Californian longer than a whole lot of natives. I can't imagine living again where there's snow. I think Southern California is the best possible place to land. In fact, LA is my favorite city.
Oh, okay.
I think anybody can fall in love with San Francisco or New Orleans.
Right.
It takes a little scrutiny to fall in love with Los Angeles. And then certainly Phil Dick too turned out to be by nature a very compatible California denizen.
You're currently living in San Bernardino, correct?
Yeah.
Isn't there a lot of snow out over there?
No. There's mountains. If we lived up in the mountains, we'd get it. But no. I wouldn't live there if there was snow. And luckily, with freeways, it's only an hour that way.
That's true.
And after all, everything is an hour.
Yeah. Of course, in those times in the 60s or the 70s, the OC was still developing, and watching or observing those, like the development of the Orange County, does it have major influences in your work, or do you see that influence through Phil K. Dick as well?
I think Orange County did have an influence on Phil Dick's work in that his previous environment, of course, had been California still, but the Bay Area. Specifically, I don't know, north of the Bay there.
Berkeley.
Yeah, San Rafael. And through no fault of those areas, intrinsically, I think they had come to represent a kind of paranoid background for him. in San Rafael, for example, his house famously was broken into by nobody knows who. It did happen. I've seen photographs, but he was kind of given veiled threats by the police, and among his acquaintance were all kind of terrible, weird paramilitary people and drug dealers and all. And so when he came down to Orange County, I think he found a sort of tabula rasa. Still California, nice weather,
Yeah.
but when he looked around guardedly, you know, for enemies and threats, he pretty quickly knows there weren't any down here. And so I think his last books, the ones written in Orange County about Orange County, such as, say, Vallis, as opposed to something like A Scanner Darkly, which, though it was written here, was written very retrospectively. I think the Orange County novels using Orange County have a kind of a more philosophical, relaxed, comfortable
Yes.
tone to them, rather than the kind of harried, frightened tone the earlier ones had.
You met in '72.
Right. He had been guest of honor at a convention in Vancouver in Canada in early 70, I think in early 72, might have been late 71. But in any case, when the convention ended, he simply stayed on. Usually guest of honors at conventions go home at the end of the convention. But he virtually had no home because his house had been broken into and all of his things stolen, and the police made it clear they weren't happy to have him around. And so for some months he simply lived in Vancouver. At first staying with friends, then alone, then he attempted suicide and wound up living in a heroin rehab place. Not that he had been a heroin addict, he was always a speed fan, but because he wanted an environment where he would be closely monitored. And in early 72 he wrote to Willis McNelly, a professor at Cal State Fullerton, and said, I got nowhere to go. I got nothing. House is gone. I have nowhere to live. And McNelly read the letter to his class, a science fiction class at Cal State Fullerton, and one of the students said, we just lost a roommate. He could live with us. And McNelly relayed this to Phil Dick, who immediately got on a plane. Okay, I'm there. Which indicates, I think, the degree of his desperation. And I knew the two girls, and they said, we're going to the airport to pick up Philip K. Dick. Would you like to come along? And I luckily had only read one of his books, but he was a name I knew, like John Brunner or J.G. Ballard or something. So I said, yeah, I'll come along. And we went to the gate, and here he came, gray beard, suitcase tied together with an extension cord, jacket that was too small for him because he'd been doing a lot of heavy manual labor at the heroin farm. And he looked cheerful but desperate, which after all, look what he was doing. He was flying God knows how many hundreds of miles to move in with somebody he had only heard of through one letter. And we drove back from LAX to Fullerton, and I was chatting with him idly. It's lucky I had only read one of his books, and that much previous, because I was therefore able to speak to him. If I had read many of his books, I would have been too choked with awe to do more than just spit and stammer. But he moved in with these two girls, and it turned out that what they had for him was a couch to sleep on, and they expected him to buy all the groceries. And so very shortly he met a young man in one of McNally's classes who had just got divorced, had an extra bedroom, and so Phil moved in with him instead, and it was much more convenient and relaxed and unstressful.
Was that still around Fullerton as well?
Yeah, yeah, it was just on Quartz Lane, slightly off of Placentia there.
Orange County in the 70s consisted of massive orange groves, is that correct? Were there massive orange groves around here during that time?
Not then. You'd have to go back to 60s really, I think, to find a lot of that. Now, if you drive down the 55 to the beach, there were a lot of orange groves down there, where now there are giant, weird office buildings with impenetrable names on the side, you know, Unix or something. But Fullerton kind of pretty much looked then as it does now. I haven't been to Placentia in many years, but I bet some of the weird old Mexican restaurants are still there that we used to hit then.
Was there a Laz Paz there, or like he mentions it a lot in Scanner Darkly?
A lot of what?
Laz Paz, I think that's what it's called. Laz Paz restaurant. It's like a Spanish.
Oh, yes. Yeah, there was a La Paz restaurant. I'm trying to remember where exactly it was. Mexican restaurant, as you'd gather. There was a place called Fiddler's 3 that we used to hit, which was roughly Yorba Linda and Placentia. There was a sort of enclosed atrium garden at roughly Harbor and Chapman on the southwest corner, and a restaurant there called The Cellar, which he thought highly of. Probably none of these places are still there. He did like, when he could afford it, going out for a nice dinner. In those early days, he could seldom afford it. A lot of times, him and me and this guy, he had moved in with Joel, and a couple of girls who lived across the hall at that apartment, would wind up putting all our quarters and nickels and $1 bills on the table and thinking, can we afford to eat anywhere? Maybe this is just like ice cream. What do we got? He was definitely as broke as any of us during that time.
I know that you were saying that during the summer you were doing janitorial work at a local.
Yeah, I would pay my tuition by, during the summer I was janitor at the Newport Costa Mesa School District. And during summers, janitors mainly do sort of maintenance, massive cleaning type stuff. And really it was easiest job I've ever had. Very slow paced, because after all it's summer, there's no students around. If it wasn't for the fact that I had to be at work at 7 a.m., I'd probably still be doing that. Actually I probably had lots more pocket money than Phil Dick did.
Did he ever do anything like that, like manual labor or any sort of job like that?
No, I mean not from 72 on.
Okay.
God knows what he got up to when he was younger, but he mostly lived on royalties, and the royalties were scanty. Luckily, he had a lot of foreign publishers who paid much better than the domestic ones. And of course, you only have one domestic publisher, but every one of those other countries has publishers, and so even though they individually perhaps pay less, in totality they can completely outrank the domestic income.
Could you explain like the tone and the environment around the Orange County during the 70s? Professor McNally was saying that there's like a Nixon conservative kind of background here.
That's true. I don't know if it's still accurate at all, but certainly in the 70s, Orange County was perceived as being a very Republican colony. And Phil Dick certainly perceived it that way. I think it helped that Disneyland was in the middle of it. Disneyland was kind of iconic to him.
That's right.
He liked it, but it always seemed to loom larger in his view of the world than in anyone else's. And of course the Lincoln robot made a huge impression on him. Certainly he felt more isolated politically in Orange County than he had up in the Bay Area, where everyone by default pretty well would have been fairly liberal, almost you'd assume it was a given. And he was, of course, very liberal in his instincts and reflexes. In about 1968, several science fiction magazines ran a 2-page sort of statement. One page was, "We, the undersigned, believe that the United States should remain in the Vietnam War to fulfill our obligations." The other page is, "We, the undersigned science fiction writers, believe we should get out of the Vietnam War." And Phil was in, of course, one of the get out of Vietnam. He was on that page. He never was a completely comfortable fit in any ideological template. For example, he was by nature very liberal, grew up in Berkeley, but he was always powerfully anti-abortion. Wrote the story, what was the story? The Pre-Persons, that was published in the 70s, I think, sometime, and got in a horrible fight with Joanna Russ through the mail about his opinions on that. But in spite of feeling sort of ideologically isolated in Orange County, he was always very comfortable. He never felt threatened at all. Never had the kind of guard up caution that was apparently a daily routine, a daily attitude in around the Bay Area.
It seemed like since he was living for so long like that in Berkeley, he kind of says that like living in Orange County kind of bored him.
Yeah, yeah. I think at first in Orange County he did have kind of a watchful, on guard attitude. Like I remember very shortly after he moved in, he would notice cars parked on the street that had CB radios in them and think, uh-oh, who's monitoring us? But very quickly, within a month or two, he kind of caught on, oh, that's not called for here. Those are old reflexes from that other place. No need for that here. And so, yeah, I think he did somewhat find it boring. Not enough to want to engender some risks, but boring and productive. I think he got a lot of very serious writing done. He, for example, rewrote Scanner Darkly because Judy Lindell Ray, when she got the manuscript, said, okay, fix it. Yes, we'll buy it, but go over it again. I think that surprised him. I think he had been used to dealing on a kind of first draft goes basis with Ace Books. So I think he had a more leisurely style. Certainly something like the Exegesis, the nonfiction million-page thing that he spent so much time on, isn't the sort of thing he could ever have thought of at previous stages of his life.
He did frequent Disneyland quite often, right?
Yeah. And more than most natives do. Yeah.
I heard that he asked his last wife.
Yes.
Yeah, to get married over there. Do you mind telling that story?
Yes. Well, a bunch of us had gone to Disneyland, and we kind of all split up and said, "Go where you like, but be back here at 4 p.m. At an outdoor table at the Carnation Sidewalk Cafe there on Main Street." I hope that's still there. Oh, good. So I wound up back there, and Phil and Tess were there. They were sitting across the table from me, and we're waiting for everybody else to arrive. And Phil looked at Tess and said, "Tessa, will you marry me?" And I thought, oh, wow. I don't want to be here. This isn't a place I belong. This scene should not include me. So I took a pickle off Phil's plate. We had ordered and finished sandwiches. I took a pickle off his plate and turned to look down Main Street. And Phil sort of went, "Just a sec, Powers, what are you doing with my pickle?" And I said, "You were done." And Tessa's trying to answer. He goes, "Just a sec, Powers, I was not done. I was saving it for last." I said, "Oh, here." He goes, "I don't want it after you've been gumming it." And Tessa's still trying to answer. He says, just a sec. "Powers, I don't want it after you've been gumming it." I said, "Well, I'll get the waitress to bring you another." He says, "I don't want to bother the waitress. I just want to make the point that you shouldn't take food off people's plates without asking first." I said, sorry. And by this point, all our friends had arrived, and we all stood up and marched out. And so poor Tess didn't get to answer on that occasion. Evidently, he asked her again when I wasn't around.
Did you actually get to go to the wedding?
No. When Tess moved in with him, they largely became an isolated couple gradually. But I think by the time of the wedding, I don't think it was just me. I think most of the people Phil had met in Orange County up to that time had kind of lost track of him. He married Tess and moved to a little apartment up Ruby, slightly up from Quartz Lane there. And I'm sure they had friends, but the crowd he had met between arriving in Orange County and falling in with Tess lost track of him.
I heard that you didn't really get into contact with him until like 1976?
76 sounds about right. He one friend, Isla Howard, who had been at the wedding, had maintained contact, was invited to party Phil and Tess were throwing at their Santa Venetia house in Fullerton, and said, "Can I bring Powers?" And Phil said, "Okay." And so I went over there and saw him for the first time in a year or so. And I think the marriage was breaking up. I know there was one woman at this party who he was, as they said, scheming on. And that kind of implies the marriage is not at its best. And he said, "Powers, that philosophy professor is hitting on that girl. You got to get him away from her." I said, "Okay, how?" He said, tell him you've got mathematical proof of the existence of God." I said, "Okay, but he might want to see it. Should I write it out?" He said, "Yeah, here's paper and pen, write it out." So I drew a circle and had arrows and wrote like Aeschylus and Logos and various math equations. And I barged in on the professor and said, "Excuse me, Professor, I have here what I believe is mathematical proof of the existence of God." And he ran away. And Phil came up, "Oh, good. And later Phil came up again and said, "Powers, he's doing it again." So I ran over and said, "Professor, I'm not sure you've given sufficient attention to my mathematical proof of the existence of God. And he ran away again. And Phil came up and asked to keep my proof of the existence of God. It may still be in his papers somewhere. But at that point, he was beginning to get back into circulation, and I think the marriage was beginning to deteriorate. I remember at one point, Tessa had a baby bird that had fallen out of a nest and was trying to keep it alive, and he said, yeah, she gives it raw hamburger and sugar water. I said, is that what you give to baby birds? He says, it's what I get. And then I don't know when they split and when the divorce would have occurred, but we stayed closely in touch from there through his death.
Just going back, Blaylock, Jeter, Dick, and then yourself, Powers. Tell us about this dynamic between all you guys and the influences that you guys brought into each other.
Well, let's see. McNally sent Phil a photocopy of Jeter's novel, Dr. Adder. And Phil read it and was very impressed with it and tried for a number of years to get it published and eventually succeeded. And so K.W. Jeter became part of the circle. And I knew Blaylock and brought him in, so he was part of the circle. And we would mostly sit around and waste time. Phil was unemployed, we were college students. It was very easy to just take a day off, day after day after day. And all the arguments in Valis between David and Kevin and Horse Lover Fat pretty well are genuine discussions we really did have. KW was always talking about his dead cat and how the fact of his dead cat disproved God. And I was probably frequently quoting C.S. Lewis, though never quite so bad as the bit in the book where he says to the David character, would you please not tell us what C.S. Lewis would say about this? Could you do us that one favor, please? I wasn't doing it like that. And mainly it was just all of us pretty much at leisure. You know, none of us had real jobs, as I recall. It seems to me Jeter maybe did, but it was at night. He was like a night guard at Juvenile Hall. But during the day, we all just sat around, drank beer, and talked about random stuff. Weirdly, since Blaylock and Jeter and I were all, as they say, aspiring writers, we didn't really talk to Phil a lot about that. We're kind of shy about that. We would say to each other, I wrote this, read it, mark it up, tell me what you think. Okay, I'll read it, but you read this of mine. You know, we would do that very much, very freely among one another. But somehow it would have been presumptuous to approach Phil and say, read this, let me know what you think. During the course of that 10 years, each of us, Jeter, Blaylock, and I, did at some point give him something to read. But I think it was always an emergency. For me, it was when Laser Books collapsed, which had been my first and only publisher up to that point. And the editor said, you owe me back the $500 I gave you for the next book, which we would have published if we hadn't gone out of business, but you got to give me the $500 back. And I had to jump back into my pizza parlor job, and I had the book that they would have published if they hadn't gone out of business, for which they had given me a $500 partial advance, and I totally needed to sell it. And so I did go to Phil and say, what do I do? Look, here's this book. They went out of business. I'm working in a pizza parlor, man. What do I do? And he read it and wrote to his agent and said, I recommend you take Powers on. And they said, no, thank you. But later that same agency did, some years later, they did take me on. And he did help get Jeter's Dr. Adder published. And he did, I believe, help get Blaylock's first book published. Certainly he had a blurb on it, a very nice quote on the cover, which from Philip K. Dick is a big factor. So yeah, we each of us did hit him up for help at least once, but mostly we were kind of too shy to.
Did Philip K. Dick ever actually give you like manuscripts when he was writing the novel, or when he was writing novels?
Yeah, not so much, I think, give me a critique as check us out. I remember being in his living room when he was writing Valis, and he said, here, read these first 13 pages. So I'm sitting on the couch reading them, and from the other room he says, how do you spell Eliot? As in T.S. Eliot. So I said, E-L-I-O-T. Okay, I hear tappity, tappity, tap. And he goes, how do you spell nuclear? N-U-C-L-E-A-R. Tappity, tappity, tap. And there was a third word too, I can't recall now. But it was fun later when I read the book. I said, here's Eliot and nuclear both on the same page. That was the page he was typing when I was sitting in the living room. So he was always not a bit unwilling to let you read what he was working on, but I never got the impression it was in a sense of, please give me your critique of this, which I would never have presumed to do in any case. I mean, not like I was 20, you know.
You do a lot of extensive research, the backgrounds of certain characters. Did Phil K. Dick do this approach, or was it more like something that was visceral? Like something
yeah, visceral would be a good word for it. He would research a lot in things like philosophy, theology, to sort of figure out the basic conundrum of the book. But no, I'm pretty sure he would not wind up doing any research like in if the character was a marine biologist, I don't think he'd spend a whole lot of time researching marine biology. Or if the story took place in London, which I don't think they ever did, I don't think he would have spent an inordinate amount of time familiarizing himself with London. And he never, like I outline like crazy. I can't start a book till I've outlined it to insane detail. He would not, but it occurred to me one of the large purposes of an outline is so that when you come back to it in the morning, you see where you were and what's next. He never left it. He didn't come back to it in the morning because he never went away from it in the evening. The way he would write a book is he would start it and 12 days later he would finish it. Even after he had quit, I mean, I think he developed that habit back in the old Speed days, but even after he quit Speed, that was how he knew how to write a book. And so he would simply, I mean, I guess he would sleep and eat. You can't go 12 days without sleeping or eating, but he wouldn't eat or sleep enough. And he would, it was really just one fast burn, and he would come out the other end. And so he arguably didn't need to make notes to himself, because notes you write are for when you come back to the work after having stepped away. He never stepped away.
So like in the manuscripts he had, would he mark it up, or would he just type it and just leave it as is?
A good point. They were typed and presumably first and final draft, because he knew I was a collector, so he gave me manuscripts. And there were never any earlier drafts, for example. But then visibly, he would go over the typescript with a pen and touch it up a bit, but not to the extent, it wouldn't be revised to the extent of typing it again. There would never be that much change.
Are there any influences that you have, like in his writing style, like that kind of way? Like, did any of it rub off onto you?
I think to the extent, I think I learned, I don't want to claim I am like him. I'm just as good as Phil Deck because, but I think my characters are a good deal more believable and solid than they would otherwise have been because of the example of how he handled characters. His characters, one factor is his characters always have a job. They always are very concerned how they're going to make rent, how they're going to pay for dinner. Even if there's a crisis, the world's ending, they still, well, I got to open the shop. You know, I got to sweep the wall. I got to get the cash register open. And their romances, his characters' love lives are so unfortunate. Altogether, his characters, I think, are the most tangible and believable. Actually, I don't think of any other science fiction or fantasy writer that that does as well. And I'd like to think that my own characters have benefited from me studying his example, and maybe some of the plot stuff too, like not just put your characters into stressful situations, but put them into insanely stressful situations. I probably, to the extent I do that successfully, I would have picked it up from him.
Was very isolated in like the political realm around here, or just
Isolated politically, to some extent isolated in general. Certainly he didn't move in a big circle of people, but neither was he a recluse. He frequently was at Blaylock's for dinner and Thanksgiving and just any old occasion at all. He would go to the movies. I remember he went and saw Raiders of the Lost Ark with us. He would go to Los Angeles to socialize with this guy Roy Squires, rare book dealer and private press printer in Glendale. So he was social. He wasn't, as I say, a recluse, but he didn't know dozens and dozens of people. You could live in Orange County and be a science fiction citizen and really never even learn that he lived here.
That's true.
He didn't, for example, do book signings, seldom went to conventions.
Jack Shandy says, maybe it's better to be an outlaw with purpose than a citizen without. Was this just, like, I would say, like, can you see this within, like, Phil K. Dick? Was he just like a rebel during the time, or was he just more like not as social as?
He was always, I don't know, rebel implies not just being at odds, but fighting. He was certainly always at odds with any prevailing default philosophy. He was more often Christian than not. He'd vacillate, but he was definitely more often in the Christian side of the dial than not. I think he definitely felt out of sync with his century, whether, you know, he should have been born 500 years earlier or he should have been born 500 years later is arguable, but the fact is he was not at home in 1930 through 1980. Certainly his reading, his taste in music, all of his interests and consumptions were very widely spread, largely in the 20th century, but by no means exclusively. In philosophy, he was always reading the pre-Socratics, who include, I think, Pythagoras, and novels. He was kind of very early 20th century. Yeah, he certainly didn't fit comfortably into any typical or characteristic niche in the 20th century. So rebel, at least to the extent of not being sitting in an assigned seat, I don't think he was a rebel in the sense of manning the barricades, though.
Seems to be very like subversive and like influenced by counterculture and things of that nature.
Yeah, he definitely counterculture. His tastes were, in music, for example, were classical and rock. And he always would say stuff like "far out." I don't think I ever heard him say groovy, but luckily. But yeah, he was definitely strongly affected, deflected by the whole '60s countercultural thing. Which, how could he help it in Berkeley, Bay Area? Also, after his marriage broke up, he threw his house open to anybody that wanted to stay there, which turned out, of course, largely to be underage runaway girls and young doper guys, and so yeah, what you could call youth culture kind of came at him rather than him going after it.
In A Scanner Darkly, he talks about a lot of locations, and a few of them are fictional. He locates the New Path Rehab Center on Catella Avenue, and like near an off-ramp for the 91. Is there any significance about that area?
Not that I think of. I've always wanted to go find the place he initially lived with those two girls. It was on South Gilbert. Some scholar could find out where it is, because he probably wrote a letter with that return address.
That's right, yeah.
But Catella, no, I don't think of it. I don't think of anything significant about Catella. I know he had Kevin and Horse Lover Fat go see the Valis movie at a theater that used to be right at Catella and Tustin.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if the theater may still be there, but no, I don't click on that. Of course, the real place was a place called Ex-Calais up there, yeah.
How much fast food did he eat?
How much
fast food did he eat? Because he seemed to love eating pizza and talks about McDonald's.
Yeah, I think what he really mostly ate, I think, was like Stouffer's frozen stuff. Trader Joe's used to have a whole lot more grocery type stuff than it does now. That is other brands than Trader Joe's stuff. And yeah, I know when we go out for dinner, for example, I think of a Denny's, I think of a Mexican restaurant in Glendale. I remember chicken livers and clam strips. Yeah, it was always kind of fairly fast food type stuff. Yeah. What would the opposite be? I suppose if he cooked at home, which he really did not do. I don't think I ever saw him like cut up an onion or anything like that. Tess would have cooked when they were married, but yeah, it was actually largely Stouffer's out of Trader Joe's freezer.
You write in this genre of secret histories. Are there any influences that are drawn from the Orange County for yourself as well, or Yeah. Are there any influences from Orange County?
Not so much Orange County specifically that I think of, but Los Angeles. Los Angeles has, luckily, a kind of a comprehensible history. Before 1900, it's really kind of just farming community, and so you can kind of comprehend LA's history, as opposed to like London or Rome, where nobody can comprehend it. It goes to thousands of years. So yeah, I think the fact of Los Angeles has an influence on me, and also the way LA and Southern California in general is so varied. You can have deserts, mountains, oceans, all of it within an hour of one another.
Any discussions between you and Phil K. Dick that just had a lasting hallmark to you, or like kind of like a landing pad for yourself that just like launched off for all your ideas, or anything that may have influenced you like heavily? Other than, of course, having discussions with him.
Nothing specific. Certainly, he did serve a purpose in being an example of a very intelligent, very well-read, very introspective, and successful writer who took Christianity enormously seriously. I think that was valuable, because if in the sort of flux of college sophistication, it might have been very easy for me to dismiss Christianity as, outmoded, valuable in its time, no doubt, but everybody's seen through that now. If it weren't for the sort of lighthouse on solid rock example of him, who obviously was not stupid, was well-read, was a brilliant writer, and at the same time took it as very serious, crucial fact. I think that was probably a big example. I never thought of it before, but maybe without that example, I would have zipped off into convenient agnosticism.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Powers.
Well, thank you.
For your time so much.
That was fun.